Hello, everyone, and welcome to Novara Live. I'm your host, Dalia Gebrial, and I'm joined today by Stephen Methven. Stephen, how are you doing today?
Hey, Dalia. Yeah, I'm okay. It's been a kind of hectic news day. Pretty exhausting, actually. How about you?
Yeah, likewise. We do have a kind of feel-good story to end with, though, at least. So hold on for that if you can. Right. Coming up tonight, the IDF has opened fire on an EU diplomatic delegation in the West Bank. The Justice Secretary is considering mandatory chemical castration for serious sex offenders. And Kneecap member Mo Chara has been charged with a terror offence. So make sure you stay tuned for all of that. And as ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. 2 workers at the Israeli embassy in Washington have been shot dead. Yaron Lachinsky and Sarah Milgram were leaving an event at the Capitol Jewish Museum on Wednesday night when a lone gunman fired on them, killing them both. Yaron Lachinsky was originally from Germany but moved to Israel in his teens. Described as a devout Christian by a former university teacher, Lachinsky had known from a young age that he wanted to be a diplomat for Israel. Sarah Milgram was a Jewish American who was hired by the embassy to organize missions and delegations. The suspected gunman in the killing was arrested shortly afterwards, with police naming him as Elias Rodriguez, a 30-year-old researcher from Chicago. Yoni Chalin, who was inside the Jewish Museum when the shooting took place, told Fox News what he witnessed.
About 9:07, 9:08, we heard between 10 to 15 gunshots, roughly. I don't know the exact number. And all of us were a little bit startled, but, I'm from D.C., so gunshots are not pleasant, but not something I've never heard before. Next thing we know, I did see somebody run in. The security guard happened to let this guy in. I guess they were thinking that he was a victim. And he was covered in rain. He was clearly in trauma. He was in shock. And, some of the people at the event brought him water. They sat him down. Are you okay? Were you shot? What happened? And he's like, somebody call the cops, bring the cops in. So about 10 minutes later, when the cops actually came in, he said, I did this. He said, sir, I'm unarmed. He put his hands up. He grabbed a red kufi out of his pocket and started the Free Palestine chants. There's only one solution, Intifada revolution. And he was being dragged out of the building as he was yelling Free Palestine. And he kept yelling Free Palestine. I, tried to hand him his kufi back because I didn't really realize that he murdered 2 people. About 5-10 minutes later, we start to gather more data. It turns out he was in the building with us for like 15 minutes. Thank God he left the gun in the bushes outside, or he left the gun outside. And we found out that I think it was 2 people from the embassy that were murdered in cold blood. And obviously this is a secondary source, but my friend was actually watching the security footage, and he murdered somebody, executed them from the back, 5-10 shots.
Footage shot from inside the museum appears to confirm some of that account. This was the moment Rodriguez was restrained by security.
No. Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
The FBI is currently investigating whether the shooting is linked to terrorism or a hate crime. But journalist Ken Klippenstein has published what he says is the shooter's manifesto. It ends with this. A word about the morality of armed demonstration. Those of us against the genocide take satisfaction in arguing that the perpetrators and abettors have forfeited their humanity. I sympathise with this viewpoint and understand its value in soothing the psyche which cannot bear to accept the atrocities it witnesses, even mediated through the screen. But inhumanity has long since shown itself to be shockingly common, mundane, prosaically human. A perpetrator may then be a loving parent, a filial child, a generous and charitable friend, an amiable stranger, capable of moral strength at times when it suits him and sometimes even when it does not, and yet be a monster all the same. Humanity doesn't exempt one from accountability. The action would have been morally justified taken 11 years ago during Protective Edge, around the time I personally became acutely aware of our brutal conduct in Palestine. But I think to most Americans, such an action would have been illegible, would seem insane. I'm glad that today, at least there are many Americans for which the action will be highly legible and in some funny way, the only sane thing to do. There has been widespread political reaction to the killings. US President Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social. These horrible DC killings, based obviously on anti-Semitism, must end now. Hatred and radicalism have no place in the USA. Condolences to the families of the victims. So sad that such things as this can happen. God bless you all. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer posted this. I thoroughly condemn the anti-Semitic attack outside the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. Anti-Semitism is an evil we must stamp out wherever it appears. My thoughts are with their colleagues, family, and loved ones, and as always, I stand in solidarity with the Jewish community. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar made this statement to the press.
I have been worried for the past few months that something like this would happen. And it did. And the list of fallen Foreign Service members has grown today. This is the direct result of toxic, anti-Semitic incitement against Israel and Jews around the world that has been going on since the October 7th massacre. Recently, we have witnessed an unprecedented wave of terror attacks and attempts against Israeli missions around the world, with an emphasis on Europe. There is a direct line connecting anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli incitement to this murder. This incitement is also done by leaders and officials of many countries and international organizations, especially from Europe. The words are the modern blood libels. These libels about genocide, crimes against humanity, and murdering babies paved the way exactly for such murders.
Those references to Europe by Saar are about a slight toughening in the attitudes of countries like the UK and France towards Israel in recent days. These have involved politicians calling Israel's assault on Gaza intolerable, and the breaking off of free trade talks between the UK and Israel, and also the application of further sanctions against Israeli settlers in the West Bank. The killing of the embassy workers has also emboldened some US politicians to air their most depraved fantasies for Gaza's future. This was Republican Congressman Randy Fine on Fox News.
The fact of the matter is the Palestinian cause is an evil one.
Yeah, and Congressman, there is a ceasefire deal on the table right now that the White House is hoping both Israel and Hamas will sign on to. Does this shooting change anything when it comes to the course of the war or the negotiations to end it?
Well, I think it speaks to the importance of the only end of the conflict is complete and total surrender by those who support Muslim terror. In World War II, we did not negotiate a surrender with the Nazis. We did not negotiate a surrender with the Japanese. We nuked the Japanese twice in order to get unconditional surrender. That needs to be the same here. There is something deeply, deeply wrong with this culture, and it needs to be defeated.
Stephen, what do you think the fallout of this is going to be?
Well, I think the fallout is going to be that this is going to get a lot more attention than the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So it's going to draw eyes away. At the very least, it's going to draw eyes away from what's unfolding in Gaza at the moment. But I think what it shows is something about the nature of genocide, that it's an act of such abhorrent, anti-human violence that it serves as a kind of contagious form of madness. And that's because when you have to witness it day in and day out through your phone screen and on your TV, it begins to make permissible things that weren't previously permissible, because there is a driving urgency to somehow bring it to an end. And that, I think, is the logic of genocide, is that it's a continual escalation, an escalation of the kind of violence that's happening in the Strip, but also an escalation of what becomes possible for people who are pushed into a position of just wanting it to end. Now, the killing of these embassy workers is tragic. it's no more tragic, of course, than the killing of any of the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Palestinians who've been killed by Israeli weapons in Gaza, many of them children. They are the subject of political violence, just as these embassy workers were the subject of political violence. And I think it is, political violence. There's a manifesto, I'm talking about the killing in Washington now. There's a manifesto, there's a declaration of support for a free Palestine, and so forth. And I don't want to get into the rights and wrongs of political violence. I'm not a pacifist by any means, and I'm generally not interested in moral arguments in the realm of politics. But it is worth asking what the impact of this is going to be, and whether it's going to serve the cause of Palestinian freedom or ending the genocide in Gaza. And I think that the answer to that is it probably won't. So, as I said before, one very foreseeable effect of carrying out an action like this is that it is going to draw attention away from where everybody's eyes ought to be. We're covering it. So in a way, we're culpable. It's a very big story, and I hope that we're covering it, and I think we're covering it in a very different way from how you'll see it covered in other media. But it's going to be all over the headlines and all over our TV screens for a very long time. And what will be bumped out of the way instead will be, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, as well as the ongoing assault on the Strip. The other thing is that it won't create new reactionary forces in the US or in other countries. It won't create people who want to suppress Palestinian freedom and who want to, as it were, continue to uphold Western hegemony. But it will embolden them, and it will create support for that. There'll be a swing. There'll be a security swing. And that will be very difficult for Palestinian protesters, the Palestinian movement in the US, and probably in other countries as well. And it also comes at a moment where it really only serves Israel. We saw this week, as you said in the piece, Dalia, a kind of, inch by inch move from some European countries, including the UK, to begin speaking in more condemnatory language about Israel. This now serves a kind of narrative for Israel, and as you saw, Gideon Saar was sort of airing it there, that it's this kind of removal of support which is going to license anti-Semitism, as he put it, around the world. So, I think it's, if you read that manifesto, and you did read a bit, there's a lot in it which is about wanting to hold people accountable. And I think, often political violence is about holding people accountable and trying to get some kind of justice. But there's a real question about, whether there's also occasionally or sometimes a kind of individualistic tendency to do that for the sake of one's own soul, one's own sense of moral righteousness, which fundamentally operates against the political goals that one might have in mind. I mean, people will disagree about this, but to me, I think that this act and the manifesto that comes with it shows a remarkable lack of discipline and solidarity, actually, because I think that what will follow was probably predictable. So I think that's what the fallout will be, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the idea that it won't create a security swing, but it might embolden one is probably quite accurate there. A group of diplomats in the occupied West Bank were visiting the Jenin refugee camp on Wednesday. Amongst them were representatives of China, Japan, and Mexico, as well as several European countries, including Britain, France, and Ireland. They were there being briefed on the situation in Jenin by members of the Palestinian Authority. Then this happened. If you're listening on the podcast, what that footage showed was the diplomatic delegation scrambling as Israeli soldiers very clearly fired in their direction. Now, the Israeli military has said essentially our bad, posting this online. Earlier today, a coordinated entry of a diplomatic delegation into Jenin took place. During the coordination of the entry, the delegation members were given an approved route to follow given their presence in an active combat zone. According to an initial investigation, the delegation deviated from the route and arrived in an area where it was prohibited from staying. An IDF force operating at the point fired a warning shot. There were no damage or casualties. After the incident, and after it became clear that it was a diplomatic delegation, the commander of the Judea and Samaria Division, Brigadier General Yakidolf, immediately investigated the incident. In addition, the commander of the civil administration, Brigadier General Hisham Ibrahim, ordered the unit's officers to immediately speak with the representatives of the countries and will soon hold personal conversations with the diplomats and update them on the findings of the initial investigation conducted on this matter. The IDF regrets the inconvenience caused. Very strange last sentence there. We're not talking about rescheduling a meeting last minute. We're talking about people being fired at for walking in Jenin. The countries of many of the diplomats on the delegation are, of course, not happy with that explanation. The governments of both France and Italy have summoned the Israeli ambassadors to explain their military's conduct. Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister Simon Harris said this: "I'm shocked and appalled at reports that the IDF fired shots in the vicinity of a visit to Jenin today by a group of diplomats, including 2 Irish diplomats based in Ramallah. Fortunately, no one was hurt. This is completely unacceptable and I condemn it in the strongest terms." From the UK, Minister for the Middle East Hamish Falconer said this: "Today's events in Jenin are unacceptable. I have spoken to our diplomats who were affected. Civilians must always be protected and diplomats allowed to do their jobs. There must be a full investigation and those responsible should be held accountable." The Israeli military has been gradually destroying Jenin since January this year when it launched its Operation Iron Wall. At the time, Israel Defense Minister Israel Katz said this: "The IDF is operating powerfully in the Jenin refugee camp to thwart terrorists and destroy the infrastructure of terror, as we saw here today. The Jenin refugee camp will not return to what it was. After the completion of the operation, IDF forces will remain in the camp to ensure that terror does not return." So far, 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced by Israel's operation in the occupied West Bank. In Jenin, Israeli forces have also destroyed water reserve tanks, as well as nearly 200 Palestinian homes. Stephen, not to ask you to look into your crystal ball again, but what impact do you think this might have on diplomatic relations between Israel and the countries that were affected?
Very little, very, very little. I mean, the great irony here is that delegation was in Jenin to see how Palestinians were being treated under this Israeli operation, and they were given a kind of curated route, an agreed route with the IDF. And according to the IDF, they strayed from it, and the soldiers treated them like Palestinians. So they actually did get to see what it's like to be a Palestinian in the occupied territories. The operation there, as you say, has displaced 40,000 Palestinians since January. Hundreds of homes have been destroyed. And, as we know, Palestinians, even before this operation, are fired on all the time by Israeli security services, Israeli military in their own territory. This is the thing that, is like so easy to forget, that this is Palestinian territory. This is their home. This is their land. And yet the Israeli military has free rein to fire on them, to kind of corral them, tell them what streets they can use, what streets they can't use, where they can be and when they're allowed to be there. And if they're not, if they're there when they're not supposed to be according to Israel, then they don't just get shot at or fired at, they get shot. So these European diplomatic delegates, they got a first-hand glimpse of the life of Palestinians in Jenin. in the occupied West Bank in general. But it's not like our governments don't know that that's how Palestinians are treated. Of course, there's going to be some frisson about the fact that these were diplomats who should be, enjoy a certain kind of immunity or a certain kind of freedom. I mean, we saw just very recently 2 of our own MPs deported by Israel for turning up to go and look at the West Bank. We also saw, British citizens killed by Israel in Gaza when they were, doing humanitarian aid, and there was absolutely no fallout from that. So, yeah, I don't think that some IDF gunfire, which didn't hit anybody. I think if someone had been hit, it would have been a completely a bigger story, but maybe not even that much bigger, which didn't hit anybody. I don't think that's going to change anything because, Israel's done so much worse. We've all seen Gaza. It's done so much worse in the West Bank, and that hasn't changed anyone's policies to anything. So, yeah, I think a few scary bullets fired towards some diplomats is not going to create some huge geopolitical shift.
Yeah, I mean, those diplomats went to find out more about how Palestinians are being treated in the West Bank, and I guess they really did find that out. I think it's obviously, and you mentioned there, the barring of 2 British MPs from entering Israel because they also were there to find out more about the Palestinian experience. And, unless you are going on a very heavily curated tour, it's very difficult to access these areas. We don't have journalists, for example, in Gaza because we obviously have journalists in Gaza, those, people in Gaza who are also journalists, but journalists from outside, and we rely on them very heavily, but journalists from outside are not allowed in. There's a reason for that, stopping the flow of information and, making sure that the only people who are able to give that information are people that then Israel can turn around and try to discredit, although that has not worked because, that the journalism that people in Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza have been a lifeline for the media, for the outside world. But yeah, that stopping that flow of information is, of course, incredibly important. And, it's funny that they kind of try to fudge it and try to say, we're going to investigate, sorry for the inconvenience caused. It's like, we know that Israel has been systematically targeting not just Palestinians in Gaza, but aid workers, diplomatic figures. They targeted the UN, UNRWA. We know from the World Central Kitchen, they spoke about, when their aid workers have been killed, it's not been in this kind of fire, in the crossfire of, an active combat. The head of the World Central Kitchen said that their aid workers were killed systematically. People went the IDF went car by car, killing aid workers. So yeah, I mean, you're completely right that this hasn't told us anything that we don't know, which is that for Israel, there are no red lines. But I think it's obviously still worth reporting so that it's important that we don't stop being shocked by this activity. Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood has announced she is considering mandatory chemical castration for the most serious sex offenders.
I also asked the review to consider how we manage sex offenders. The review has recommended we continue a pilot of so-called medication to manage problematic sexual arousal. I will go further, with a national rollout beginning in 2 regions covering 20 prisons, and I am exploring whether mandating the approach is possible. Of course, it is vital that this approach is taken alongside psychological interventions that target other causes of offending, like asserting power and control.
The recommendation is one of several made by former Justice Secretary David Gauke as part of an independent review to deal with prison overcrowding in England and Wales. Other proposed measures include a progression mode in which offenders can be released after serving a third of their term if they are deemed to have good behaviour. It would also see releasing and tagging those with murder and rape convictions after serving half their sentence. And in the case of reoffence, the person would be sent back to prison to serve the remainder of the original sentence, plus the time for the new offence. So, what is chemical castration? Chemical castration involves injecting drugs that inhibit testosterone in men. 97% of recipients of one of the drugs used in chemical castration have almost no detectable levels of testosterone in their blood after just one injection. The theory is that suppressing the sex hormone will lower sex drive. However, the evidence on whether this actually reduces the risk of committing sexual abuse, for example, against minors, is unclear. A clinical trial in Stockholm tested the drug on men who had disclosed, quote, paedophilic tendencies, but had not yet been convicted of a crime to see if it reduced their risk of acting on these tendencies. According to Sky News, results showed that the men did have a reduced risk of committing child sexual abuse. However, like other similar clinical trials, the sample was very small, and many criminologists argue that these lower results cannot be provably connected to the treatment. Libido-suppressing drugs for sex offenders have been trialled in a pilot scheme in southwest England since 2022, and the Justice Secretary is proposing a nationwide rollout of the trial, expanding it to 20 prisons across England. Within that trial, chemical castration was voluntary, but the Justice Secretary has stated that she will be exploring whether the intervention could be made mandatory for sex offenders. Other countries that mandate chemical castration for paedophiles include Poland, Russia, Moldova, and Estonia. And Germany and Denmark also use chemical castration, but only on a voluntary basis. To discuss this story further, I spoke earlier to Katie McFadden, a criminal defence solicitor. I began by asking her what she makes of the controversial proposal.
I think the proposals themselves are incredibly problematic, particularly Shabana Mahmood's comments in relation to making this mandatory. There appears to be very little published and peer-reviewed evidence about the impact of these treatment programmes, which were initially rolled out in HMP Watson in 2007. According to the review, they've since been rolled out into an additional 6 prisons from 2016 onwards. But according to the review and the references within that, that's all based on anecdotal evidence. So it appears that no one has properly studied the impact of these programs in order to say whether or not they actually even work.
Yeah, and so given that context that, we don't know if this really works, and obviously there is a problematic history of chemical castration being used in these kinds of punitive contexts, what are the risks to you of the rollout of this kind of measure? What kind of precedent could this set?
I think it's a really dangerous precedent. And, as you referenced, it is one that we've had set previously within history. Alan Turing, probably the most famous example of the policy at the time where homosexual men could choose to go to prison or be chemically castrated. We look back on that now as an absolutely devastating period, a disgusting thing for us to have done to other human beings. And it's really the choice that is most important here. You cannot force people to undergo medical procedures unless they entirely willingly and voluntarily consent to it. And that's something, they need to be aware of the risks, of the possible benefits of undergoing something. But informed consent is the most important part of any sort of medical procedure. And so to imply that can be removed simply because we as a society don't like a group of people is a really dangerous path to start down.
Well, of course, some people might say that the difference between the Alan Turing situation and the situation we have now is that when we're talking about child sexual abuse, we are talking about, extreme harm on a vulnerable group of people. What would you say to those people?
Yes, clearly this is a huge issue within society. And it's clear that this is a programme that has been going on a voluntary basis. It appears there has been some positive take-up from it. But it has to be voluntary. Forcing people to do this is not going to fix the underlying issues. When it's rolled out when it's provided currently, it's part of a package of psychiatric and psychological support and rehabilitation. And it really does come down to that choice. There are no proper reviews to say whether this works, but even once reviews are carried out, which is the recommendation of the report to do that data gathering exercise effectively and do that analysis, even if positive outcomes are shown from these studies as they currently stand, doesn't mean that it would have the same impact if it were implemented on a mandatory basis. Effectively, the participants, as they are currently, are self-selecting. They are people who have made the decision to partake in this programme and take up the other support. They've clearly reached a turning point where they've wanted to engage with this. So even if there are positive outcomes of these current pilot programmes, which it's kind of ironic to call something a pilot programme when it's been running since 2007. But even if there are positive outcomes, doesn't mean anything in terms of whether it will work on a mandatory basis.
So you mentioned there something about not addressing the root causes. And one thing I found quite interesting was the Justice Secretary kind of made this separation between offences caused by what she calls problematic sexual arousal, which theoretically would be curbed, although the evidence is not conclusive, but would theoretically be curbed by administering these drugs, and sexual offences caused by a desire to assert power and control. What do you make of that distinction, and does it make sense on a legal level?
I think that's actually a really dangerous distinction, because at what point do you draw the line? Do you say, oh, Mr. Smith's offending was caused by problematic sexual arousal and so he should never go to prison, but Mr. Bloggs had a desire to assert power and control and they've done exactly the same thing, but one goes to prison and the other doesn't? I think it's a really odd distinction to start to draw, and it's just not something that we're able to do. People can speculate as much as they want about the causes of child sexual exploitation, sex offending in general, and what the root cause of that is. But we can't just blindly make assertions about one being power and one being uncontrollable urges and then start people on prescriptions for the rest of their lives without having an actual scientific basis for it. It's pure speculation.
This is maybe more of a kind of political question, but given, as you say, the research does not establish a causal relationship between reduced risk of committing a sexual offence and these drugs, taking these drugs, especially if it's forced upon someone. Why do you think the Justice Secretary and the Gork report have made this a headline? Why do you think they're going down this route if we don't actually have that evidence-based kind of legitimization of it?
In defence of Mr. Gork, the recommendation of the report is actually to gather more evidence. It's specifically to gather a comprehensive evidence base around these types of programmes to check whether they are effective and whether they should be rolled out further. In terms of Shabana Mahmood's approach, I don't know why she's taken this line. It seems an easy headline grabber, which detracts from the very real problem that we are facing, which is that our justice system is crumbling around our eyes. Our prison system is not fit for purpose, and really serious changes do need to be made.
And so if we're going to sort of zoom out and look at the Gork report more broadly, obviously this was one of dozens of recommendations that the Gork report made. What do you make of the kind of broader suite of proposals that the Gork report made when it comes to addressing overpopulation in prisons?
I think actually a lot of them are quite sensible, but will need to be implemented very carefully to ensure that they're actual and to ensure that they're capable of actually working in practice. As it stands, our prisons are completely full. They are overcrowded. We have people who are being imprisoned in police stations, in police cells, because there is simply no cell space left for them in the prisons. And that has a significant knock-on effect on the ability of the prisons to manage the population. People are being kept locked up for really significant periods of time. I've got clients who've been locked up in a single cell for 3 days in a row and just not let out. That means that the rehabilitative work that should be done with people in prison is simply not being done. I wholeheartedly support early release of prisoners and the provision of stringent licence conditions within the community that will allow rehabilitative work to be done so that they are properly reintegrated back into the community. Now, the issue with that is that has to be administered. It has to be managed and run by the probation service. And the probation service are so overstretched and underfunded that they are at capacity. Are they capable of administering all of these new measures? I think they're probably not. So significant resources will need to be put in to ensure that that's able to be done safely and effectively. I wholeheartedly support the reduction in short prison sentences being imposed. Sentences of 12 months or less are only actually achieve one thing, and that is removing any form of stability that a person has in their life before spitting them back out into the streets 6 or 12 months later with no support network. The probation service and the offender management units simply don't work with prisoners who are serving short sentences. So there is no rehabilitation provided to them whilst they're in custody. There are a shortage of approved premises, and for the vast majority of prisoners, by the time they've served their short sentence, they've lost whatever accommodation they had on the outside. So they end up being released street homeless with very little support. And they've lost contact with their families for the few months that they've been inside because they haven't been able to keep in contact with them properly. It really does just create a cycle of reoffending behaviour where people do become institutionalised because they're not able to cope properly within society. So I think the reduction in short-term prison sentences is a very sensible approach, and I really do welcome that.
A member of the Irish rap group Kneecap has been charged with a terror offence. Liam O'Hanna, who performs under the name Mo Chara, was charged for allegedly displaying a flag of the proscribed organisation Hezbollah at a gig in the O2 Forum in November last year. The Metropolitan Police have said this, that basically the reason that displaying that flag has been charged in this way is because it violates the displaying of a flag in such a way or in such circumstances as to arouse reasonable suspicion that he is a supporter of a proscribed organisation. Kneecap have insisted they do not support Hamas or Hezbollah and, quote, condemn all attacks on civilians always. The charges come following weeks of intense scrutiny after old footage was dredged up of them shouting "Up Hamas, up Hezbollah" at a concert. They also came under fire for projecting pro-Palestine messages on the stage at Coachella, in which they condemned Israel for, quote, committing genocide against the Palestinian people and the US government for arming and funding Israel despite their war crimes. In response to the charge, Kneecap issued the following statement on Twitter. 14,000 babies are about to die of starvation, with food sent by the world sitting on the other side of a wall. And once again, the British establishment is focused on us. We deny this offence and will vehemently defend ourselves. This is political policing. This is a carnival of distraction. We are not the story, genocide is. As they profit from genocide, they use an anti-terror law against us for displaying a flag thrown on stage, a charge not serious enough to even warrant their own Crown Court. Instead, a court that doesn't have a jury. What's the objective? To restrict our ability to travel, to prevent us speaking to young people across the world, to silence voices of compassion, to prosecute artists who dare speak out. Instead of defending innocent people or the principles of international law they claim to uphold, the powerful in Britain have abetted slaughter and famine in Gaza, just as they did in Ireland for centuries. Then, like now, they claim justification. The IDF units they arm and fly spy plane missions for are the real terrorists. The whole world can see it. We stand proudly with the people. You stand complicit with the war criminals. We are on the right side of history. You are not. We will fight you in your court. We will win. Free Palestine. Stephen, do you agree that this is political policing and a carnival of distraction?
Yeah, completely. That statement was, fucking amazing. And like, what I hate about this story the most, Dalia, is that it is so lame. It's like lame as fuck. It is so uncool. You know, we actually used to be a cool country where we had like a great tradition of punk and political expression on stage and on albums. That was meant to rile up the establishment, to challenge the state, to shift people out of their comfort zones and, get them agitated. And, Kneecap is in that tradition. I mean, they believe in the causes that they're performing about and that they're sort of displaying on screen or in their concerts. But it's also happening in the context of a concert, like a theatrical event. What's next? It's like, are we going to start pulling actors off stage who are carrying a Hezbollah flag in a play that's written about, resistance? Are we going to, even if the playwright, for example, supports it, is that going to give us a reason to like shut down theatrical productions, to shut down films, to ban novels? This is crazy. It's crazy and it's uncool, and it shows such a lack of confidence on the part of the state for the arguments that it's making. It shows that the state knows its own arguments are bad, insofar as it even has arguments in support of Israel. And so it's so desperate to shut down anything that looks like dissent. But dissent in art is vital. It's so important. Like, you want to make, people want to make Britain great again or whatever. Well, the way you do it is you do it by our artistic production, our cultural production. It's always been the way in which Britain has exported itself around the world. And this kind of, really lame. What was the wording used in the by the CPS? I mean, could be seen to be by somebody, maybe support of a prescribed organization. So what? They're a punk band. Let them look like they're supporting a prescribed organization. Maybe even let them support a prescribed organization. I mean, leads me to the next question, which I'm hoping that maybe you have an answer to, Dalia, because I don't know. Why is Hezbollah even a prescribed organization? I mean, I can see why, you might prescribe the military wing, let's say, you might think there's cause there to do that. I wouldn't agree actually, but government might. But why is the political wing of Hezbollah prescribed in this country? Why is this, political party which has a role in government, which has a role in many, many communities in Lebanon and sort of is interwoven with the structure of civil society? Why is that banned? And that flag, by the way, is just the Hezbollah flag. It doesn't represent the military wing, doesn't represent the political wing. It is just the flag of Hezbollah. Why is it prescribed? Do you know, Dalia?
Well, I mean, I can't get into the brains of the British state, but I can say that it is quite recent, actually. I mean, the military wing has been prescribed for a while, since the early 2000s. But the political wing has only been prescribed since 2019. So it's actually was quite a recent move. And it was done by Sajid Javid. But honestly, I have to agree with you. The hysteria is absolutely comical and disingenuous. I mean, the British establishment would love the fact that all of the headlines, that all of the moral outrage are about what a punk band that they hadn't heard of a year ago displaying a flag on stage or projecting certain images on stage. And I think, Kneecap have been really, really determined to consistently bring that attention away from them and onto the actual matter of hand. And I don't know, when will the British establishment have even an ounce of the moral outrage that they have for this punk band, for Kneecap? When will they have an ounce of that for the genocide that they are aiding and abetting? I mean, when is that day going to come? I mean, Spurs won a trophy last night, so maybe anything is possible. I'm willing. Hope is a discipline. That's what we've learned from the supporters of Tottenham. And so, yeah, I mean, I just think that when history looks back on this, it's just going to be like, whilst, at the time, as Kneecap said, at the time when 14,000 children are at risk of dying from starvation, you want to talk about a flag at a gig? I mean, it's comical, and it's deliberately trivializing the very things that we are talking about right now, by making us talk about something that happened at a music concert rather than what is happening in Gaza with our tax money, with our weapons, with our political legitimization. And yeah, I think that Kneecap have tried really hard to push that attention off of them, but the British media can't help themselves, can they? Spanish citizens in popular destinations have long complained about the impact mass tourism has on their standards of living. Protests against the industry have happened across the country each summer for the last 2 years. And this summer isn't set to be any different. Last month, protesters demonstrated against mass tourism in central Barcelona, firing water guns at passing holidaymaker coaches. In Menorca, there were protests against the number of tourist cars allowed onto the island, where the number of vehicles crowding the destination pretty much doubles every couple of years. And more than 150,000 marched in Madrid over spiraling housing costs, chanting, "Get Airbnb out of our neighbourhoods." Rents in the city doubled over the past decade, while housing prices have soared by 44%. Now, Spain currently has a left-wing government headed by socialist Pedro Sanchez, and it seems they've listened to those calls. They've now ordered Airbnb to take down 65,000 holiday homes because of their impact on house prices, with the government saying the number of buy-to-holiday let properties violate tourist housing norms. The 60,000 homes are ones that the government say haven't complied with Spain's rules for registering tourist properties. According to the Ministry for Social Rights, the properties either failed to provide a license number, provided a fake one, or didn't specify whether the owners were renting on a professional basis or as a private individual. Speaking to the reporters, the Minister for Social Rights said, quote, "No more excuses. Enough with protecting those who make a business out of the right to housing in our country." What a beautiful sentence. Can you imagine a government protecting the interests of their citizens who want to live in a home over private capital, over rentier capitalism? Who could have thought it? Not me. Spain is the second most popular tourist destination in the world, attracting 94 million overseas visitors last year. That's a market that private short-term landlords have been keen to cash in on. There are 320,000 homes with holiday rental licenses in Spain, a figure that's grown by 15% since 2020. And some parts of the country are taking even more severe measures, with Barcelona's mayor having pledged a total ban on tourism rentals by 2028. Now, Airbnb has vowed to contest the government's decision, with a spokesperson saying this: "The root cause of the affordable housing crisis in Spain is a lack of supply to meet demand. The solution is to build more homes. Anything else is a distraction. Governments across the world are seeing that regulating Airbnb does not alleviate housing concerns or return homes to the market. It only hurts local families who rely on hosting to afford their homes and rising costs. It goes without saying that if this is just a housing supply problem, which it isn't just a housing supply problem, but let's say that it is, surely repurposing the existing supply to house people now is part of addressing the housing crisis. Because if you have a housing crisis and X number of those homes are being used as, holiday homes, used for profit, used for rent, to extract extortionate rents from tourists that obviously local people cannot access or afford, then freeing up some of those homes for locals is going to make a positive impact. No, Stephen?
Yeah, completely. And I think one of the most ballsy aspects of that Airbnb's statement is this capitalist company whose whole business model is changing on a temporary or permanent basis actual homes that people live in into short-term tourist accommodation. Them saying to the Spanish government, you know what? You should trust us more than the people out protesting on the streets. You should trust us about what your policy around home ownership or access to housing in Spain should be, rather than the people who vote you in. It's like a kind of classic sort of encapsulation of neoliberalism there, right? The idea that the kind of corporate world somehow kind of overarches the state, and the job of the function of the state is no longer to serve the people that live in it and that make it work, but rather the corporations that sort of I don't know, parasitic on it in lots of ways. And what you say is it's such a bogus claim about housing stock. Yeah, I'm of course supplying new homes, building new homes will ease a housing crisis, but it'll ease it much more slowly if these kind of corporate vampires are able to snap up a proportion of it just as it gets built to serve the needs of tourists who have a lot more money to spend than local populations. So, yeah, I'm very, very glad that the government of Spain is not listening to Airbnb and pushing ahead. And, the thing about tourism is that it's not, and Airbnb tourism in particular, is that it's not just about, increasing the cost of housing. I mean, it's always the case that there have been very expensive parts of cities which are largely expensive because they are tourist destinations, and so the demand for accommodation increases the cost of accommodation in those areas. And if you live in a city, you just don't live in those areas. I don't know anyone who lives in Piccadilly Circus in London, for example. You just don't go there. That's just a tourist zone. Your life as a dweller in that city, as a member of, your life is elsewhere. It's in a different kind of community than what the tourists are coming to see. But when Airbnb gets involved, there is a spread of what becomes touristic. There's a kind of moving out of the center or out of those areas, and that the price rises just follow. And yeah, some Spanish cities like Madrid and Barcelona in particular, it's forcing people out of areas. It's forcing them further away from work. It's forcing them further away from families. It's had a really toxic effect, and it's no wonder that Spanish people have been protesting summer after summer against not tourism, but the way that tourism has been transformed by corporations like Airbnb, as well as not just the corporations, but as well as those people who make money out of doing it. Because that's the other thing that Airbnb does, is it creates a new sort of employment sector, which is not an employment sector where you create any value. It's rather an employment sector where you take something and you derive value from the asset you already have, which is your home, and you don't give a shit about what it does to the prices of other people's homes around you. So yeah, good on the Spanish government. I mean, I just want to say on that 320,000 that you mentioned there in terms of the number of tourist rental homes in Spain. Those are the registered and licensed ones. And what the Spanish government is doing now is going after those that aren't, going after those that evade the regulatory system, which is precisely put in place in order to regulate things like property prices, or where people are, the number of people there, and so on and so forth. So they're going for properties which are outside of that regulatory system, where people are just posting them on Airbnb without going through the proper processes that they ought to do with the Spanish state. Processes, as I say, are put in there to prevent an overspill and overflow of tourists into areas where, frankly, they don't really belong.
Yeah, I mean, I look forward to seeing how the kind of Airbnb trying to contest it, how that all unfolds. But it just kind of goes to show that even with just a little bit of political will, there is actually something that can be done to contest corporate power. So whenever governments tell you this is the way things are, the market is a force of nature, we couldn't possibly intervene, we couldn't possibly intervene to protect people's basic rights to a good life ahead of rampant corporate interest, you can just look at this example and say that's not true. You can at least try. But anyway, thank you for joining me, Stephen. Wasn't an easy show, but you were a trooper.
Thanks very much, Dalia. But I got to say, I was feeling really tired when we began. But a cute little hour with you has got me feeling all energized again. So thank you for that.
I tend to have that effect. So thank you guys, everyone, for tuning in. I hope you feel the same. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.